Hello everyone. First of all, thanks to the organisers for putting on this forum in the present difficult circumstances and for inviting me to give this presentation on phonation in Semitic languages, Semitic laryngeal phonetics and phonology. The topics to be addressed in this talk are firstly two ways of considering the role of the larynx in speech production as a tone generator or as a breath flow regulator. Secondly, the laryngeal phonetics and phonology of emphatic consonants from Proto-Semitic to some present-day Semitic languages, looking at allophonic variation and distribution, some instrumental phonetic data and morpho-phonological processes. Then considering some facts about diachronic change in Semitic languages, and finally Sibawayh's features majhur and mahmus, which will be looked at in relation to what's been said in the talk. Just to remind you of the larynx and its main parts, here's a diagram on the left showing its location in the throat at the base of the pharynx, and a zoom-in view down into the larynx. We can see here the vocal folds and the gap between them, known as the glottis. We can regard the larynx as a mechanism for generating a laryngeal tone, or we can regard it as a mechanism for regulating airflow from the lungs through the glottis into the mouth. The tone generator view leads to a division of sounds into those having a laryngeal tone, which we call voiced, and those without a laryngeal tone, which we call voiceless. The images you can see are taken looking down into the larynx at the vocal folds and the gap between them called the glottis. The top two show the glottis in voiceless states, the pre-phonation state on the left with a narrow glottis and the open or aspiration state with a wide glottis on the right. The lower two show the vocal folds positioned for voicing with modal voice on the left and breathy voice on the right. But instead of dividing the glottal states into those that generate a laryngeal tone and those that don't, we can divide them according to whether airflow through the glottis is impeded or not. Sounds produced with the glottal states on the left, pre-phonation and modal voice, have low airflow due to lack of a wide aperture and are consequently unaspirated. Those on the right allow much more airflow and are consequently aspirated. I'll be using the terms unbreathed and breathed as the relevant laryngeal features. The importance of this for Semitic languages is that it groups voiceless unaspirated sounds, i.e. sounds with the glottis in the pre-phonation state, differently. The voiced-voiceless division groups them with voiceless aspirated sounds, but the unbreathed breath division groups them with voiced sounds. Examples of the sounds in question are shown beside the pre-phonation image. The equal sign denotes unaspirated. So the question for this talk is which division is better for the laryngeal phonology of Semitic languages. A good place to start is with the consonants of Proto-Semitic. Proto-Semitic had 5 triads of homorganic consonants, each triad comprised of voiceless consonant, a voiced consonant and an emphatic consonant. It's now generally accepted that the emphatics were ejectives, that is to say, sounds produced by closing the glottis and using the larynx as a piston to compress air against an articulatory closure in the mouth. To demonstrate, the alveolar triad comprised voiceless, probably aspirated t, 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 voiced d, 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 and ejective emphatic t. Under the tone generating view, emphatic ejectives have in common with the voiceless members that they lack laryngeal tone, but they have in common with the voiced members that they lack aspiration. The interesting question here is what happens when emphatics become pulmonic sounds, as they have in modern Semitic languages, with air passing through the glottis. Will they remain voiceless due to absence of laryngeal tone, or remain unbreathed due to absence of aspiration? We're going in the next few slides to have a close look at emphatic consonants in two modern South Arabian languages, Mehri and Heselwood, drawing on published and ongoing work by Janet Watson and myself. Modern South Arabian languages are among the Semitic languages that have changed the least since Proto-Semitic times. They have both ejective and pulmonic variants of emphatic consonants, therefore they're good to look at for how emphatics became pulmonic, as Watson and Bellham point out. What then are their emphatic consonants like? As a group, do they lack laryngeal tone or lack aspiration? We'll be looking at evidence from allophonic variation, instrumental phonetic evidence, and morpho-phonological processes in verb stem morphology. Here we have a table showing the typical realizations of the voiceless, voiced and emphatic stop consonants in Mehri in three prosodic contexts. Looking at the foot medial context, where the consonant is in the onset of an unstressed syllable, we see that emphatics have three variants: the original ejective of Proto-Semitic, a voiceless unaspirated pharyngealized variant, and a voiced pharyngealized variant. The feature unbreathed covers all these variants. Looking at the prepausal context, we see that the emphatic realizations are the same as the realizations of the voiced consonants. The contrast is neutralized, as Watson and Bellham have shown. Emphatic stops are never aspirated in modern South Arabian languages, as far as I know. It's worth noting, however, that in English the situation is a bit different. Ejective variants are variants of voiceless stops. They tend to occur prepausally, so they pattern along with aspirated ones. The common factor being lack of laryngeal tone. You can see the distribution in the table. The laryngeal phonology of English thus fits a voiced-voiceless framework. So we should assess what fits each language, not try to shoehorn languages into an assumed universal framework. Laryngography used to be an uncomfortable procedure, but it's much better now. The two electrodes you can see placed on the speaker's neck on the right-hand photo, on each side of the larynx, pick up the vibrations of the vocal folds and represent them as a larynx waveform, the LX waveform on the screen underneath. The glottis is closed during the peaks of the waveform, called the closed phase, and open during the troughs, called the open phase. Air cannot flow through the glottis during the closed phases, but can during the open phases. You can see that the airflow waveform is the inverse of the LX waveform. The ratio of the closed to the open phase is known as the closed quotient, or QX. A low QX value means the open phases are longer, allowing more time for air to flow through and mixing aspiration with the voicing. As QX values drop below 40%, voicing sounds increasingly breathy. If this happens at the edges of vowels next to a voiceless consonant, it indicates that the glottis is open for that consonant. If it doesn't, if QX remains over 40%, it indicates the glottis is in the pre-phonation state for the consonant. So by taking QX values at the edges of vowels, we get evidence of the glottal state of the adjacent consonant. The following slides present QX data for Mehri and Heselwood coronal fricatives. These intervocalic examples are of a voiceless fricative on the left, a voiced one on the right, and an emphatic underneath. Listen to each in turn. Voiceless. Voiced. And the emphatic. In each panel there's a spectrogram, a speech waveform in blue, an LX waveform in green, and two traces, a green one representing pitch and a purple one representing QX values, which is the relevant one for us. Looking then at the voiceless one, the changes in QX value are given underneath the panel. The first vowel has a QX of 39%, which drops to 28 as the glottis starts to open for the voiceless S. When voicing starts up again for the second vowel, it's at 32%, rising to 43 for the body of the vowel. In the word with the voiced fricative, a QX of over 40% is maintained from the first vowel through the voiced fricative into the second vowel. The interesting thing is what happens in the case of the emphatic fricative. This particular one is a geminate. It's clearly voiceless as there are no laryngeal vibrations during the fricative, but the QX does not drop the way it does for the voiceless fricative. This indicates the glottis is not abducting for the fricative, but is maintaining much the same position as for voicing, just opening slightly into the pre-phonation state. The laryngeal feature unbreathed covers the emphatic and voiced fricatives to the exclusion of the breathed voiceless one. The pattern is essentially the same for the cognate fricatives in QX evidence for an open glottis during the voiceless fricative and a glottis in the pre-phonation state during the emphatic fricative. This is what they sound like. Voiceless. Voiced. And emphatic. To me, the emphatic sounds voiced, but it clearly isn't from the laryngogram waveform. Marijn van Putten has presented evidence that Arabic Sa'd was not voiceless at the time of the Quran. It functions in consonantal rhymes alongside voiced Z, not alongside voiceless S. It's possible, therefore, that the emphatics of modern South Arabian languages preserves the quality of the Quranic Arabic Sa'd. The same QX difference is found in the Mehri natural fricatives, which sound like this. There isn't a voiced one in the language. So the voiceless one and the emphatic the fricatives are in initial position and the panels underneath are zoom-ins at the onset of voicing for the vowel. A low QX for the voiceless fricative, indicating the glottis has been open during the fricative, and a higher QX for the emphatic, indicating the pre-phonation state, such that voicing is able to start up at its target QX value. For comparison, here are examples of the plain seen and emphatic Sa'd of modern Arabic, courtesy of a speaker from Oman. Not one of the speakers of the modern South Arabian languages, I should add. It's quite clear from the QX values being low at the vowel edges that both fricatives are produced with the glottis in the open state. Sibawayh's classification of Sa'd Sibawayh was writing in the 8th century. His classification of Sa'd as a mahmous consonant alongside Sin suggests that Sa'd became a fully voiceless consonant sometime between the time of the Quran, which is given as 610 Common Era, and Sibawayh's Kitab, which was written the latter half of the 8th century, around 780. Although we have to assume different variants will have existed in different dialects, but it does enable us to pinpoint to some extent when that change may have taken place. Just play you the two. Not that I really need to, but here we go. Here's the voiceless one. And the emphatic. Let's have a look here at the same speaker's triad of coronal stop consonants in Arabic. The QX evidence is consistent with what we've seen so far for the glottal states of plain and emphatic Semitic consonants. The plain show as truly voiceless with an open glottis, and the emphatic shows as voiceless but unaspirated with the glottis in the pre-phonation state. Aerometric data from 3 Arabic speakers shows high airflow for voiceless t, k, ta and kaf, and much lower airflow for emphatic and voiced ta, qaf, dal, and also for hamza. I'd just like to consider on this slide an unusual phenomenon that occurs in Mehri and Slehret, which is the completely silent articulation of sonorant consonants in prepausal contexts, and to consider in particular how it best fits into Semitic laryngeal phonology. I'll briefly talk you through the panel on the right before playing the video on the left. At the top of the panel on the right is the speech waveform showing the voicing of the vowel. Under that is a phonetic transcription of the word showing that it begins with F, followed by an emphatic lateral fricative, a long back open vowel ending in creaky voice, then a long glottal stop, and while the glottal stop is in place, a silently articulated L, alveolo-lateral approximant. Under the spectrogram are palatogram frames tiered in 2 rows, successive frames alternating top, bottom, etc. We'll ignore the lowest display. Under the lateral fricative you can see the pattern of contact between the tongue and the roof of the mouth, and on the spectrogram you can see the acoustic material of the fricative, i.e. the acoustic output of that articulation. Under the silent L you can see the same pattern of contact, both sounds are laterals, but there is no sign of any acoustic output from the articulation on the spectrogram and no voicing on the waveform. This is odd for a sound classed as a sonorant. In non-prepausal contexts, this L is produced as a normal lateral approximant. So how should we classify a phoneme that is systematically silent in a common prosodic context? The glottis is totally shut, so no aspiration and no voicing. The feature unbreathed seems to me to cover it unproblematically. One might even say that it's the unbreathed par excellence. There's absolutely no sound, no breath, no airflow, no nothing. In the video you'll see the articulatory contact for both laterals appear in the palate display, which is the bit that's circled. Again. It's quite possible the video didn't play in the previous slide. Sorry if that's the case. Moving on to morpho-phonological processes, we'll look at what happens to the initial root consonant of verb stems in 2 varieties of Mehri, Mahriyot and Mehreyet. This particular type of verb stem is one where the first vowel lengthens. These are known as L stems. I'm grateful to Janet Watson for supplying the examples. The crucial thing to notice here is that if the first root consonant is voiceless, it geminates in L stems and the stem takes a high short vowel prefix, a schwa type vowel. We can see that in the first row of the Mahriyot. The first root consonant is K, and in the L stem it lengthens to a geminate as well as the vowel being long, a kormal. But if the first root consonant is either voiced or emphatic, it doesn't geminate and it takes a low short vowel prefix. So the first one there has a g, agoreb, and the emphatic one has an emphatic vela, akoleb. So there's no gemination of those consonants, but there is a gemination for the voiceless one. It's easier to account for this pattern, which is pervasive, if we make the binary division into breathed, in which case you'd get gemination and a high vowel, and on the other hand unbreathed, where you get no gemination and a low vowel. There are other processes in Mehri and Slehret that show the same kind of division, for example H stems and definiteness, but they have their own complications and I'm not going to go into those here. If we can accept that focusing on glottal states rather than laryngeal tone, and consequently adopting a breathed-unbreathed laryngeal feature framework is the right thing to do, then two testable predictions I think follow. Firstly, pulmonic emphatics will not be breathed without first having been unbreathed, i.e. a change from ejective closed glottis to aspirated open glottis is predicted not to happen. And secondly, they will not de-emphatize, if that's the right verb, by which I mean they will not lose their pharyngealization without first becoming breathed, i.e. depharyngealization will not happen to unbreathed emphatics. Both predictions are motivated by the fact that emphasis in pulmonic consonants is, as Bellum has importantly emphasized, no pun intended, a resonance feature, and resonance is heavily reliant on voicing for perceptual robustness, as the following slide, I hope, demonstrates.
Clean.
Which of
Clean.
these two items sounds
Clean.
the most emphatic
Clean.
to you?
Clean.
The one on the left begins with an aspirated pharyngealized stop, the one on the right with an unaspirated pharyngealized stop. I'll play the aspirated one and then the unaspirated one.
Clean. 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 Clean.
I'll assume you've chosen the one on the right, the unaspirated one. If so, the explanation for why the aspirated one sounds less emphatic is that emphasis is perceptually cued by the rising second formant transition, which I've circled and arrowed on both the spectrograms. In the aspirated one, much of that transition, the first 60 milliseconds or so, takes place during the voiceless aspiration, and we don't hear it so clearly. In the unaspirated one, the transition is mostly voiced. This insight comes from Royal's PhD thesis of 1985. I think it's quite an important point. It shows that pharyngealization, or if you think it's uvularization, is not so perceptually compatible with aspiration, i.e. emphasis is not so compatible with sounds that have an open glottis. The prediction seems to be borne out by Arabic emphatics. Looking first at the emphatic fricatives as they changed from the ejectives of Proto-Semitic into pulmonic sounds, I've found no examples of them being truly voiceless without having first been voiced or at least unaspirated. The interdental emphatic fricative is voiced in dialects that have interdentals and is prescriptively voiced in Fusha speech. The second one down in the list, the lateral emphatic fricative of Proto-Semitic, we know from Sibawayh's description that it was a voiced or at least unaspirated lateral fricative in the 8th century. It has now merged with the interdental emphatic fricative in dialects that have interdentals, and as we've seen, that is voiced. Proto-Semitic, the ejective alveolar fricative, as we've seen, is likely to have been similar to its modern South Arabian cognate, i.e. unaspirated, before becoming truly voiceless. Having become truly voiceless, it seems to be in the process of losing its pharyngealization, as shown in experimental work by Mehri and colleagues. And interesting recent work by Stuart Davis and Abdullah Al-Faifi on Faifi Arabic reports voiceless depharyngealized st cluster, st cluster for sod, and a voiceless depharyngealized allophone of the voiced interdental emphatic fricative. So it seems that diachronic loss of emphaticness in Semitic languages comes after loss of voicing, as far as I can see. Turning now to the Arabic emphatic stops. The first one in the list, the Proto-Semitic coronal ejective, is a voiceless unaspirated stop in most Arabic varieties now. The aspirated t of Cairo Arabic, which also exists in other dialects with what Bellum has called dyadic systems, developed from it and was found to be perceptually weak by Royal, as demonstrated a couple of slides ago. The modern Arabic dad is voiced, and the modern Arabic qaf is unaspirated, which is the reflex of the Proto-Semitic ejective. It also has voiced dialectal variants, but there are no aspirated forms of those as far as I know. The diachronic evidence then is that reflexes of Semitic ejective emphatics are never open glottis sounds without first being constricted glottis sounds. That is, the diachronic trajectory is from ejective to voiced or unaspirated, and only then to aspirated. Absence of breath or aspiration is, I believe, the common factor responsible for the grouping together of voiced and emphatic consonants in the allophonic variation, morpho-phonological and diachronic processes we've looked at in this talk. The advantage is that emphatics remain in the same laryngeal class of unbreathed as they change from ejective to pulmonic sounds. There's no need to say that they change their phonological laryngeal class. If emphatics become aspirated, dyadic systems arise in a process best seen as a generalizing of a plain emphatic contrast from unbreathed across to breathed consonants. As mentioned before in relation to modern Arabic Sa'd, breathed emphatics may merge with their plain congeners, which would then in fact re-establish a triadic system. Having looked at diachronic changes from Proto-Semitic ejectives to modern Semitic pulmonic emphatics, it's worth thinking about why they ended up as pharyngealized sounds instead of, say, palatalized sounds. There is, I think, a possible phonetic explanation. In the production of an ejective, as mentioned before, the larynx acts as a piston. It's hoisted up in order to compress the air above it against an articulatory constriction. In the diagram here, the constriction is at the velum for the production of the velar ejective stop. A small volume of air can be compressed more quickly and more efficiently than a larger volume, so it makes sense for speakers to reduce the volume of the pharynx if such a thing is possible. Well, fortunately such a thing is possible and can be done in two independent ways. As it says on the diagram, the muscles of the pharynx, the pharyngeal constrictor muscles, contract, which pulls the rear and lateral pharyngeal walls inwards, thus reducing the volume of the pharynx. But in addition to this, the epiglottis and the root of the tongue can be retracted into the pharynx, which makes the pharynx even smaller. If this gesture persists through the change from ejectives to pulmonic sounds, the result will be pharyngealization. So that may well be what happened and why modern Semitic languages have pharyngealized emphatics. In the light of what I've covered so far, I want to consider the majhur-mahmus distinction in traditional Arabic grammar. Except for Sa'd, Sibawayh, writing in the 8th century, grouped all emphatics, all voiced phonemes and Hamza as majhur, which we can gloss as loudly spoken or loudly, clearly spoken, and all voiceless ones as mahmus, which we can gloss as whispered sounds. These categories exactly match the glottal states unbreathed and breathed, respectively, though they've often been interpreted to mean voiced and voiceless. That Sibawayh and his followers focused on regulation of breath flow rather than on generation of tone is clear from their writings, as acknowledged by Gairdner in 1935 and Blanc 1967, and also I think by Howell in the late 19th century. In the following quotes, transliterations and translations are taken from Heselwood 2019, in which the debt to Janet Watson and James Dickens for translations and for advice on transliterations is gratefully acknowledged. Those of you who know Arabic can read the transliterations, but I'll just read out the translations. So Sibawayh himself said that a majhur sound is strongly supported in its place, and impeded is the breath from flowing with it until the support is complete and the sound flows. A mahmus sound, he said, is slackly or weakly supported in its place so that the breath flows with it. The bits I've underlined are the significant bits, I think. So in majhur sounds, breath is impeded. We've seen how that happens in various sounds. And in mahmus sounds, the breath flows, is unimpeded, so the glottis is open. Sometime later, a few centuries later, Haidara said they are called majhur because their makhraj, the place where the sound exits, is not widened for the breath to flow with them. The sound becomes loud, not hidden. But for mahmus sounds, they are called mahmus because the breath flows with them due to their widened makharij. They exit with breath. The term makhraj is a bit problematic here because it seems to refer to place of articulation, but I think the breath is being controlled in the glottis, although they didn't know that. But the point is, the focus is on the flow or the lack of flow of breath. A later writer, Ibn Yaish, said much the same. The jahar, the majhur sounds, the jahar is fully complete at the exit of the sound, the breath prohibited from flowing with it, and the hams is the opposite. In order to distinguish between them, if you repeat qaf, saying qaq qaq qaq, you will find that the breath is trapped. You will not find any interference from it, i.e. interference from the breath. And if you repeat kaf, you find the breath running with its sound. Ka, ka, ka. Finally, Ibn Manzur, majhur means that it adheres to its place until the end of its sound and traps the breath that flows with it. Mahmus means a sound whose exit is softer than the majhur and the breath flows with it. So again, the significant parts are underlined. Majhur traps the breath, whereas mahmus doesn't. The breath flows with the sound. Returning to the question at the start of the talk about whether we should take a voiced-voiceless view of Semitic laryngeal phonology or an unbreathed-breathed view, I'd like to conclude that we take the unbreathed-breathed view, a view which matches Sibawayh's classification. On the unbreathed side, as you can see, we have the sounds produced with the glottis in the pre-phonation state, which are voiceless but unaspirated. They tend to be emphatic consonants. We also have the voiced sounds and sounds that involve a glottal closure, Hamza and the Proto-Semitic and modern South Arabian ejectives. On the breathed side, we have the voiceless aspirated consonants produced with an open glottis, and also the effect these consonants have on the voicing of an adjacent vowel, an effect that involves opening the glottis and increasing airflow, resulting in breathy voice just prior to the opening or just before the closure of the opening, or just after the closure of the opening.
And now,
before finishing, a word or two about VOT, the voice onset time measure. I noticed some papers to be presented in this forum will be reporting VOT data, and I look forward to those. From VOT data we looked at and reported on in modern South Arabian languages and in Arabic, it's insightful to consider not only the duration of a long lag VOT interval, but also the relative level of intensity of any aperiodic aspiration type noise going on during the interval. This slide here shows the VOT intervals highlighted in pink for a velar ejective realization of the dorsal emphatic stop in the Mehri word kanon on the left, and the voiceless aspirated dorsal stop in the Mehri word kaup, with an ejective realization of the prepausal B, which is interesting, on the right. The ejective has a much longer VOT of 61 milliseconds compared to 46 for the aspirated stop, but you can see very clearly on the waveform that there is much greater aperiodic turbulence for the aspirated stop, so a durational measurement on its own could be misleading. I'll just play those sounds, those words.
And now.
And the other one.
Go.
Again, the ejective.
And now.
And the voiceless one.
Go.
On this slide we have the Arabic qaf on the left and kaf on the right. Both have VOTs of plus 25, 24 milliseconds, but again there is greater aspiration noise during the VOT interval for kaf. I'll just play these to you. It's just the syllable qa, and the voiceless one again, so it's just the central bit of shaqqaq, just the qa. And voiceless. Okay, on this slide we've got energy spectra for the two VOT durations of the sounds we've just listened to. Green for qaf and blue for kaf. You can see that the aspiration noise for kaf has peaks well above the 20 decibel line which I've drawn across, even extending up to 30 decibels, but qaf doesn't have those peaks, they're much lower. And this despite an atypical QX value at the vowel onset of the qa syllable of 30%. Breath must therefore be controlled by the respiratory muscles if the glottis is in the open state. As a concluding remark then, in the study of laryngeal features in Semitic languages, might phonation therefore be a bit of a red herring? Is it better to think first and foremost in terms of glottal states and the regulation of airflow through the glottis? So finally, I'd like just to ask those involved in looking at the laryngeal phonology of Semitic languages to at least consider whether the breathed-unbreathed features are more helpful in making sense of their data than voiced-voiceless features. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll try to answer any questions you might have. Meanwhile, here are the cited references. I'll leave the references up for a minute or so in case you want to copy any of them down.